Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great event on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use that question and answer tab there on your interface and submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We do have a polling question during today's webinar as well, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged with that. And speaking of engaged, we have a very interactive chat feature on our interface, and so we encourage you, you've got a question, comment, suggestion, whatever you want to share with us, please go ahead and use that public chat and submit it, and we'll keep a close eye on the chats and see what we come up with. And then finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Taming Infrastructure Access, Getting Hands-On with Role and Access Discovery. Our speaker today is Justin McCarthy, who is the co-founder and CTO at strongDM. Justin, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
All right. Well, I'm going to put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and let you get right to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. All right. So you've met me, and I'm going to introduce myself a little more thoroughly in a moment here. But in essence, what we're going to do today is talk about this problem that is just a recurring theme for us as we work with our customers, and we just wanted to offer a little bit of sort of some recipes that we've come to over the years for succeeding in this very human discovery process. We put some of those lessons into a tool that is going to be sort of the second half of this presentation. So it's something that should be a great starting point. Yeah, we hope that you'll be able to begin your discovery journey using it. So just a few words about myself. So I'm the CTO and co-founder at strongDM. So strongDM is the infrastructure access platform. So our product is concerned with the who of authenticating a user into the service, authorization for your infrastructure at the correct access level, the connection layer, so we actually handle the networking aspects of connecting users to infrastructure. And then sort of access observability, so the ability to audit and see in retrospect how that access has been used. So that's all that we do, and that means that we also spend a lot of time thinking about access discovery. So let's transition to an example here. So the case is a familiar one to many of you out there. You've got a new hire. Our new hire is John. Looks like he's in the marketing team. So I'm kind of sizing him up here based on his picture. So let's see what John needs. John is asking for access to the production customer database. I don't know. He's on the marketing team. Does he look trustworthy? I don't know. He's got a beard, the glasses. I don't know. Could be. So let's just start out with a poll question here, and do a little choose your own adventure. Let's decide together whether we should give John access.
Yeah. So you can choose to either give John access, deny John access, follow an existing approval process, or all of the above. The poll question should be on your screen now, and go ahead and make your choice, and then we'll take a look at what the audience has decided, whether John is worthy or not. But while the audience is making their choice, just a quick reminder to everybody that today's event is being recorded. So you will have the ability to watch this webinar on demand after today's event. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. So fear not, if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to get all its goodness. So let's see. Looks like I think we're going to get just about as many responses as we're going to get. Things that slowed down quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll. Let's take a look at the results, which I have to tell you what they are. So let me get to them here. Looks like the majority of folks, an overwhelming 81%, said they would follow an existing approval process. 10% said they absolutely would deny John access. So he is just cut off, out of the building. No way, Jose. And then 2% or 10% said all of the above. So I'm not sure if you can give and deny John access at the same time.
I love all the above. I love total chaos mode. That's great.
All right. Well, there you have it then.
All right, that's the verdict, John. Thanks. So yes, I think that regardless of which answer we chose to this and what direction we took, I think really option C is the only one where we have any hope of knowing whether we got it right. If we give John access, John may make a good case, a compelling case, but there's always that question about whether we've given him too much access, whether he strictly needs it. If we deny John access, he's not going to maybe get his job done. So hopefully what we're going to continue to discuss through examining this role discovery process is maybe that'll make the inputs to this approval process so that when we do give John access through the approval process, John has exactly the right level of access, not too much, not too little. I think that's the hope of all these systems. All right. So another way of understanding what we're trying to achieve in the discovery process is simply answering this question. Does this person in this role, and you can think of role as a business role or a title or really just any informal lowercase r role, does this person acting in that role need access to the system, right? And that's the essence of essentially all authorization questions are trying to get to that. And a lot of times it's a function of the granularity that we've used to define the roles that allows us to answer this question clearly or identify that actually this question can't be answered clearly. Okay, so here are just a few of the many barriers that I think we've all faced before on getting hoping that we can achieve this nirvana of giving exactly the right level of access. So there's never a case where you're starting out with a clean sheet, a green field, empty list of roles and access to the system. That era always happened years ago. So you're always dealing with some level of organic growth. And probably if you're undertaking one of these access and role discovery campaigns, you're going to undertake it with that in mind, like you are reorganizing some existing access. As organic growth was taking place over years or decades, new tools, new approaches, new teams were introduced throughout, right? So that's so it's not just necessarily about not just about new teams, but also about new kinds of things. There are elements of cloud technology every quarter that didn't exist the quarter before. And yet you still also have your legacy to support. So there might be a database or a system that was, granted and authorized in 2005, still exists, still necessary, while you also, of course, need to integrate the latest Kubernetes cluster or whatever system has just been deployed last quarter. There are, of course, tools that can support process for consistent tracking, but for various reasons, they don't always have total scope. So you may have, for example, gone through an exercise to create a really fresh inventory around for example, all of your SaaS products. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have extended into, for example, all of your databases, all of your clusters, all of your servers, or the converse could be true. So you could have done a great job with inventory on your infrastructure systems, but maybe many of your SaaS applications are still a little bit Wild West. So thinking about the level of consistency you have today and what you could have is also a big problem, a big part of what makes this tricky. Okay, final point. Although there are tools, our view and our experience is that this fundamentally and first begins with a human set of questions. So we're even going to share a tool, but as you can see, it's a spreadsheet. And so proceeding with the very human set of questions and getting those questions distributed out to your organization and distributed out in a way that you can get answers back. That's to us where the campaign to discover roles always begins. And I think it's accepting that it's inevitably going to take a lot of hours of conversation. I think that's also part of succeeding with this discovery process. Okay, so let's jump into our template for conducting a role and access discovery campaign. Okay, so this sheet is going to be distributed actually in a blog post that will be published tomorrow, I believe. But this is the essence of an outline that has worked well for us, working both when we've run this internally, dogfooding it, as well as working with our customers in supporting their discovery process. I think that said, we're definitely hoping that through sharing this with you, we'll also receive some additional feedback and requests for improvement. This is something that we do intend to maintain. You can see that we put the version number in there. We do intend to maintain and improve over time. In fact, if anyone finds it particularly useful, we're open to the idea that we could even further add to it and add some little more interactivity and a little more automation, perhaps, to make some of these tasks a bit easier. Okay, so let's just go through the steps, and those steps are going to guide us through some of the other sheets here. Okay, so the first step, and this step is the first step, not necessarily because this is where your mind goes first when you think about discovering roles. This is about getting your constituency and your users enough time to give you some test cases while you work on collecting the other kind of information that you're going to need ultimately to decide on how you architect your roles. So, so step one in this case is solicit test cases. Okay, and so the way we're going to do that is it's pretty simple. This approach we're recommending is just to send out a form. So let's send out a live form to everyone that, in a very broad sense, might have access to some system. Okay, and this form is designed to be, easily answered by, you could think of it as any lay user of any aspect of any kind of system, really. Okay, so there's very little structure to it other than what role am I performing, what am I accessing, and then why. So we find that this phrasing is good enough. It applies to SaaS applications. It applies to infrastructure applications. It applies to particular data sets that someone might need access to. And that's the level of diversity that you kind of inevitably need to allow for as you're sort of collecting some of these inputs. So the way we might prompt this in an email or broadcast to a group is, if you can just think of the top 5 or the top 10 ways that you access really anything during the day, and then just type it in, and then that's all we need. Okay, so try to make it feel very light, very minimal. What you're going to get out of a request like that is a lot of redundancy, inevitably. Okay, and actually the way we think about this is that's inevitable, and therefore, like, that's okay. So if you have 10 people that all need access to Jira, or 7 people that all need access to some AWS credentials, that's expected. If they're all doing the same task, that's great, because that's actually the signal that what we've got is something recurring, something consistent, something that will aggregate into a role. Okay, so the responses might come back in the spreadsheet looking exactly like this. So as an analyst, I might need access to, let's say, a European Snowflake instance to deploy some models. As a data scientist, I might need raw traffic logs so that I can work on some ingestion task. Okay, so these are going to ultimately be a set of test cases that you're going to collect at the beginning of your campaign. And then at the end of your campaign, you're going to use the number of these that are covered by a role that you identified to judge whether you're done with the campaign. So once you achieve diminishing returns on new test cases and matching test cases to roles, then you're probably ready to transition to the next phase. Okay. So back to the steps involved in this campaign. So while we've got those test cases coming in, we're going to move on to the question of who. So because access, it can be understood as system-to-system access or person-to-system access. You might end up with some machines or systems that are whos. But I would encourage you to start first with the human access, the human reasons, and therefore the source of that who information is going to come from your HRIS, your email, your existing directories. If you have too many users, if you slightly over identify or under identify, that's fine, because again, what I think we're hoping to discover is recurring patterns, recurring themes. And that's going to be true even if you miss one or two folks. I think when you get to a rollout stage, when you're actually deploying a new role that will affect someone's access, that's when you need the sort of accounting level of precision to know that you're getting it 100% right. And I think that's just a different workflow from this discovery process. Once you get one of those sources, whether it's really any of these, SSO, directory, whatever it is, you're going to end up with a list, that looks something like this. So ideally, just in case you do end up matching some of these, for example, email keys to, for example, that test case registry that we're receiving, it might be useful to actually pull some kind of a unique identifier like an email address. In many cases, there is going to be a business title, and I think that's useful to include. It's useful to include because as the person operating the campaign, you have to use your judgment. You have to use your own intuition, and part of that is confirming some of those intuitions by lining up titles with role names, so that you can see, for example, if there's someone with a line cook business title, but they're interacting a lot with the cash register in one of the later role definition phases, that might prompt you to ask the head of that team why, and that may discover something that you wouldn't have discovered otherwise. Okay, once we've got a list of who, we're going to move on to the what's. So this essentially is going to come down to maybe a couple different categories, but I do want to just highlight two very prominent recurrent categories that we encounter a lot. So first is SaaS applications themselves. There are applications that are very familiar, very ubiquitous. I'll use Salesforce as an example. And it's something to know about. It's something to list, even if you already have a sufficient access story for that particular SaaS application. I think including in the list, if you've got one, is great. Let's say even if your primary task is, if you are concerned with data and infrastructure primarily, still reasonable to have those SaaS applications listed. Same on the other side. So if your goal is primarily to secure access to SaaS applications, it doesn't hurt to go and hunt down some of these data and infrastructure inventories as well. So in this case, your inventories may come from actually a number of different sources, depending on how your systems are provisioned. So in a lot of shops, it's actually quite common to have what we would think of as a configuration management system. So a Chef, Puppet, Ansible. It is going to have an authoritative inventory of all the instances that exist, because those instances have to be configured and patched regularly. Another common source of sort of an authoritative listing is the provisioning systems like Terraform, CloudFormation. So those are going to create big lists of instances that were created by those systems. And it's a great source to sort of mine for possible total scope. I will mention that in the case of anything that's clustered, anything that are deployed as cattle, not pets, you probably don't need every instance. So you would rather prefer to list maybe like the cluster, the auto scaling group, whatever that superior node was. That's probably what you would register in the what list. But by getting every instance, every pod, that's a fine way to sort of mine and start and identify what you ultimately want to list in your whats. Okay. Final note on here that I sort of wrote in is you sort of have to accept that you're going to have very different granularities of things. So you're going to have an S3 bucket and a Snowflake instance and a Kubernetes cluster. They're just inevitably very different granularity, very different types. They all participate in a totally valid way in some of these access sentences that we're ultimately going to build. So, I need access to an S3 bucket because X. I need access to a Snowflake instance because Y. Those sentences are true even though Snowflake and S3 are very different things. Let's pop over to an example of the what list. So you'll note here there are a few suggested default dimensions for sort of categorizing our whats. So it's very common to have a concept of an environment, especially when you're talking about infrastructure. It's somewhat common also to have a concept of geography. Now, this could be a political geography of some type, or it could be sort of a cloud provider geography of some type. Either one works, but and then global is also even in cases where you have some sort of regional definition, you might also have several resources that exist at a global scope as well. Category is pretty loose, but it's essentially there's always some way that you would think of the primary bucketing, and then what we this is also the moment where we find that it's helpful to begin talking about this concept of sensitivity. So as you can see here, what we're prompting is just a distinction between low sensitivity, high sensitivity, okay? Without really going into further definition on what that means. So we'll sort of come back to that, but the essence of it is, as you're listing things out, you should have some sense of whether, an interruption or a data breach on this particular type of resource would constitute a major concern, and that can help provide an input to your sensitivity. We're going to talk about slices in a minute, so you can just ignore that column for now. Okay, so we have our list of who, we have our list of what, and in order to be able to grant with the right level of access, not too much, not too little, we do need to tailor ultimately these roles to the who and the what. And the way we do that tailoring, it has to have some level of aggregation. If it doesn't have a level of aggregation, you end up just enumerating every instance of everything and every person. And that matrix is just too big for anybody to ever QA or get an intuition for, or review, or even care about. So you need these aggregation points on both the who side and the what side, okay? And the way we first think about aggregation, or this first rollup, is just the concept of a slice of access. Okay, so for the purposes of this discovery campaign, what we're going for is the access for essentially a single use case, but that use case might span a couple of different resource types. Okay, that use case might be something that's invoked by a data scientist and an SRE, or a software engineer and a product manager. Okay, so that use case can be something that multiple people could potentially operate. But if you just think about what's the access necessary to conduct that use case, that's what we're shooting for with slices. Okay, so like one example might be, that's provided here, reconfigure all cache servers. So anything that meets the criteria cache server, you would need a high enough level of access in order to perform that reconfiguration. Okay, and actually this gives a great example of something that I know comes up a lot when you think about authorization. And that's the distinction between role-based access control and somehow attribute-based access control. So this is the notion that in a pure role-based form, you would be able to categorize every user completely without any attention to any of their characteristics or the system characteristics that you're intending to grant access to. An attribute-based approach is one that acknowledges the characteristics of the system and of the people, and sort of joins and merges and grants authorization based on that. What we found is that those distinctions aren't particularly helpful, and if you accept that you're going to have to blend these approaches, that seems to be the happy path in most cases for us and for our customers. So I would say that inevitably elements of attribute based access control are present in this sort of final product, but it's very helpful for us to talk about roles and to talk about composing together several roles into a final sort of business title, for example. So we think of it as all the above rather than RBAC versus ABAC. Okay. Once we've identified those slices, and actually, hold up, let me just illustrate the slices for a second before we move on to roles. Okay, so here we go. So slices. What you can see here is that, again, we're trying to get at that use case, and you could think of that single use case as captured in this description. These descriptions aren't a great example, unfortunately, but the idea is that there would essentially be a single set of related tasks that all achieve some use case. Okay, and what's helpful is actually to think about. It needs a short name just so we can talk about it and give it a handle. But ultimately, this is where a lot of that attribute-based filtering is going to show up. So how you structure this name is going to differ by your environment. So in this case, you can see this shorthand that we've established here is this concept of group, level, and geo. Those aren't hard fields in this spreadsheet or any upstream or downstream system. It's just one that makes sense to modeling the particular business that we have synthetically modeled here. Okay. And the reason why inevitably you need to have some structure is because these will ultimately need to convert into something that can be technically evaluated by your automation. Okay. If you don't automate it, it needs to be evaluated by a human judging whether that access is possible or not. But any way you slice it, you're going to need to have something that looks like this that you could potentially use to distinguish, for example, this short name from that short name, this set of authorization rules from that set of authorization rules. I am going to show an example within the strongDM product of how this is ultimately manifest, but we're going to come back to that after I talk about the next layer of rollup. Okay, so with slices, what we then want to do is do a second layer of rollup into roles. So so these roles should have basically names that make them easy to understand. And then the slices provide some of the implementation details that concretely map those easy to understand concepts into a set of how it actually exists in terms of your deployed infrastructure and systems. Okay. So a role should probably contain several slices, but a role should not necessarily attempt to fully capture someone's business title. So let me switch back to the who list for a second here. So a cashier in the sales department on the retail team, you could end up with a role in your system called cashier. And that role may have the 5 or 10 slices that authorize access defined directly in it. What we find is that it generally is more productive to try and see to use essentially cashier as another essentially kind of roll up of let's say 2 or more roles. Okay. So they might have a role that's related to receiving cash, and they might have a role related to accepting an order, right? And so both of those would be embodied ultimately in the cashier business title. So when you onboard Max into the team, Max will end up with those 2 roles to achieve the business title cashier. And this tends to be important, especially for teams that have different focus areas. So if you could think of a data science team where they all have the same business title, they're always going to be studying different domains. Okay, so those domains may have technical resources that have different levels of sensitivity even. Okay, there's just no reason why an analyst studying something, some activity in North America needs to analyze something that's happening in Australia, let's say. And so by separating out those roles and slices, but still composing them back together into the final business title for that user, it just tends to allow you to do the authorization tailoring that you want to be able to do. Okay, let's take a look at roles. So in the role definitions, what we've got here is basically a list that will be appending to. And what you can see is that we're repeating the role, and then we are adding the unique slice that constitutes that role. So in this case, our SRE diagnostics role, which might ultimately, one or many business titles might have, has the build user slice, the dev diagnose message queues, dev diagnose core platform slice. Okay, so all of those constitute this SRE role. And this is where I'd like to just quickly flip over to strongDM's particular implementation of this concept. So what we have here is a data science team. You can see that as actually the word that we use for it in our product is role. So on the data science team, in the data science role, you can see that we have several access rules here that are just written out in English. Obviously, these have technical definitions because the system evaluates it. So what you can see here is that this English statement, every Redis data source with this tag, right? That corresponds to one of the slices that we discovered over here in our access campaign, okay? So the hope is that you're able to come up with these, again, you might have an automation that could evaluate it, or a human might evaluate it. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to group several of these sentences that are easy to parse, they're legible, they're easy to edit, and then they're ultimately possible for someone to evaluate. So when I'm onboarding a new user into this group, when I'm adding a new resource to the system, should data scientists have access to it? This is how you answer that question. All right, we're almost done on the little checklist here. So we did our first roll-up of slices, capturing all the use cases. We did our second roll-up, giving that collection of use cases a handle that we can hold on to and talk about, like data scientist or SRE team member or something like that. Final step is simply to go back to the test cases that we solicited at the beginning. So by now we have 100 200, 500 test cases that folks have contributed from all across the business. And essentially, we should think of this as a QA step and a completeness step to assess whether we have identified a role that can probably accommodate that use case. Okay, there's one other tool on here that we have to help sort of see that in a very like high density way. So as you can see here, what we've got is all the unique roles, all the unique slices, and so you might end up needing to toggle back and forth between this matrix of all possible combinations and which roles have the ones you're looking for to target that particular use case. And you should basically think of this as, you'll think in advance, if I can match, 80% of the test cases that come in to a best role, then we're probably ready to proceed to implementation. Whether you choose to maintain a framework like this ongoing, I think we would hope that you could, because a lot of times any authentication authorization tool or system you're relying on, it's not going to model the world in a way that you can concisely understand in a way that, for example, this spreadsheet could. Okay, so what this might end up being is a long-lived design document that you sort of come back to every quarter. And you talk about it again. You talk about the business titles, you talk about departments, you talk about teams, you talk about regions, you talk about your slices, and then you use that to guide your implementation over time. Okay, just before I switch back to the deck, so this is at version 0.2 right now. You're going to receive a copy of this template. If anyone chooses to use it, really want to hear your feedback, really want to hear your requests for improvement. You can email me directly, justin@strongdm.com. I'm very happy to receive those requests because we'd like to be able to make this reusable, as general as possible, and something that we can all come back to so that we're not starting from scratch every time we run one of these campaigns. All right, I just sort of spoke to some of these practices specifically, that you're gonna come back to this idea quarterly, something like that. Yeah, and then once you've got the source of truth, you can begin asking then how do we roll it out in an automated way that hopefully has everybody with exactly the access they need, no more or less. Okay, and with that, I think we're on to Q&A. So hopefully some questions have occurred to someone out there. Somebody got a question?
Yes, so we do have a couple questions for you, but there's plenty of time. If you do have a question for Justin, go ahead and use that question and answer tab and get it on in. Sanjeev asks, how do you ensure segregation of duties, SOD principle for SOX compliance?
Sure. Yeah. So this is I will say that this approach, this very sort of human start with a spreadsheet approach, this isn't a product, and there are GRC products out there. There are products, and I'll name drop a vendor. SailPoint does a lot of this, right? And there are a lot of other GRC products out there that are going to have like the rigors and completeness to be able to prove it. I think what we're encouraging with this framework is just, if you're starting from nothing, at least begin to add structure along these lines, okay? And that'll give you enough structure to then be able to talk about whether you have sufficient separation of duties, for example, between someone that's deploying changes to a schema that, since you mentioned SOX, that might govern some financial data, right? So who the person that deploys changes to that schema versus the person that analyzes that schema, you could probably use a framework like this to show that was the case. And if that were particularly important, what I would be doing is I would be adding that to the notes. So we could just make sure that every time we come back to this, we can say the analytics operator, right, like must be segregated. Right. And so that would be, that would be something that would be easy to understand, easy to discuss. But it would actually be quite hard to discuss if you were discussing it, looking at, a BigQuery configuration panel over here, a Snowflake configuration panel over here, and some SSH keys over there, right? So by giving you this roll up, you can actually think about and have a conversation about segregation of duties.
Cool. All right, great. Once again, guys, if you have a question for Justin, go ahead and get it on in. Here's another, and this is a good one actually. How do you reconcile access and roles between systems, especially when each system has different default roles? Admins, users, viewers, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, and maybe the reason why I keep saying the H word over and over again, this got to start with the human side of things, is because we get really path dependent on and hung up on the roles that like MongoDB gave us by default, or Microsoft SQL Server gave us by default, or in Windows the idea of an administrator and sort of everyone else, right? So those roles kind of come from the technology, and to a certain extent we get infected by them, right? It's convenient to just rely on one that's built in. It's convenient to rely on one of those roles, but because every system carves it differently, like you need to start kind of top down on this and kind of like use case driven on this, and then ultimately you need to use some sort of enabling technology to then map what you want to do to how you actually say it in SQL Server. Right.
All right, great. Another question for you. Where do things like privileged access management fit into this process?
Sure. So I think privileged access management is this just is privileged access management, but I'll say the history of privileged access management, I think a lot of times the connotation that could be associated with it is this notion of a Boolean. So this is like either privileged or not. So what kind of access is this? Is it regular access or privileged? So what I would say is that access is always, especially in 2021 and beyond, it's always this gradient. It's always this spectrum, okay? And you have very sophisticated users throughout your organization, right? And you have entry-level users throughout your organization as well, right? And so being able to understand that spectrum and being able to, as closely as possible, map the level of sensitivity and the level of trust to the role. I mean, that's it. So it's for sure we're doing PAM here, but it's blended in with everything else.
All right. So we have one more question, but I do want to let the audience know that last call, if you've got a question, go ahead and get it on in. We do still have time for questions. So if you have been shy, don't be shy, just get it on in and we'll address it for sure. Okay, here is the next question. Do you have any advice on how to start the conversation with other teams such as IT and HR, et cetera, in order to kick off this type of project?
Yep. I think that actually, like when you simplify it down to a form like this, everyone can parse this form, and then everyone can sit here on this and feel good or bad about it. Okay, so absolutely you can have folks in HR, absolutely you can have folks in IT, absolutely you can have DevOps, SRE, software, everyone can parse it, right? And so it's very easy once you collect a list of 100 of these to just start sorting them and start grouping them and say, here's a theme I see, and you know what, this theme, there's no way to handle that theme without giving them full root access to everything, right? And so we've just been giving out full root access to everything. And once you can just see the English description of that, it's easy to realize that maybe where you need to improve and easy to begin prioritizing.
All right, great. Well, that is all the questions that we have, but I'm going to leave the question and answer tab open to see if we get any last minute questions in. While we are waiting, just wanted to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, we will make that happen for you. All you have to do is check your inbox after today's webinar, because we are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the event on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. It should be right there waiting for you. All right, doesn't look like we're getting any more questions in, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period. But I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. There were some really great ones there, so thank you very much. And before we close things out, Justin, I did want to do that drawing for the $425 Amazon gift card. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Our 4 winners today are, first winner is Stephen R. Congratulations, Stephen. Our second winner today is Denise H. Congratulations, Denise. Our third winner today is JT. Congratulations, Jay. And our fourth winner today is, I think it's Rodell M. Congratulations, Rodell. And we'll be following up with all four of you by email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. And if you don't see anything there, please check your spam folder. Justin, what a great presentation. I'm a big fan of demos, so I thoroughly enjoyed watching you go through the entire process. And so thank you so much for the great presentation and the great demo. Really do appreciate it.
Sure thing.
I also
I do want to offer one more plug. Just please, if anyone goes ahead with the spreadsheet, please, Justin@strongdm.com, standing by, because we're definitely looking for suggestions. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Yes, and then there's that blog post that's coming out tomorrow, so you can always just go over to the StrongDM website, check that out as well. So good stuff all the way around. So thanks again, Justin. And I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. We're going to give you 15 minutes back in your day, so I hope you enjoy it. For now, this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.